Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling the fascinating, forgotten and sometimes unfashionable stories from history that we didn't learn about at school. The African Queen was a 1951 adventure film starring Humphrey, Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. Based upon a novel by the same name, written in the 1930s by C.S. Forester, who's more famous as the author of the Horatio Hornblower series. It's set in German East Africa, Tanzania, during the First World War, and it tells the story of how a tiny civilian launch takes on and sinks a German warship that's patrolling an inland lake. It's a great action film with tremendous acting. In fact, Bogart received Best Actor award for this film at the Oscars. But did you know that The African Queen is actually based upon real events in World War I? Because in late 1915, early 1916, the Royal Navy took on the German Navy on a lake deep inside Africa. And this is the story of that battle for Lake Tanganyika. A bizarre little sideshow led by an equally bizarre British commander in a war that around the world was costing millions of lives. What many people forget is that when the First World War broke out, Germany possessed several colonies in Africa, all of which saw some form of military action. The longest and most bitter campaign was fought in German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania. Here, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, with an army of 3,000 Germans and 11,000 local Africans, held off over 300,000 Allied troops for the whole war. It was one of the greatest guerrilla campaigns of all time and earned him the nickname the Lion of Africa. Now, I'll be telling the story about this campaign very soon, so please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss it. From the outset of the war, Lake Tanganyika was set to be a key battleground. At 420 miles long and about 30 miles wide, the lake formed the western boundary of German East Africa. Across the lake were her enemies, the Belgians in the Congo and the British in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. It was both a formidable barrier to the Allies, but also their Achilles heel. They would be forced to advance around the lake, which left their supply routes vulnerable to counterattacks if the Germans chose to raid across the water. And that is exactly what the Germans intended. A 130-strong naval detachment was sent to Lake Tanganyika. Under the command of Captain Gustav Zimmer, they commandeered the 60-ton Hedwig von Wissmann and a 38-ton tug, the Kingani, and armed them with light guns. From Zimmer's HQ at Kigoma, they then set out to clear the lake of Allied ships. By the end of 1914, they'd sunk a Belgian vessel and 2 British ships, and had achieved supremacy on the lake. This now enabled them to intercept Belgian caravans travelling along the western shore, and even launched an attack on the British settlement at A Patron, Mabala, in northern Rhodesia. In April 1915, big game hunter and Boer War veteran John Lee travelled to London with some alarming news. He reported that a huge German ship was being transported in 5,000 cases from the coast to Lake Tanganyika, where it would be assembled. You've got to hand it to the Germans, haven't you? 220 feet in length, displacing 1,500 tons, and armed with guns from the cruiser Königsberg, the Goetzen would blast any Allied ship out of the water. Furthermore, her guns could hit troops anywhere in the vicinity of the lake. And even more worrying was that the Goetzen had the capacity to transport 800 to 900 German troops across the lake in one go. This could put any Allied advance into the German colony from the west in jeopardy. The Goetzen could ferry hundreds of German troops behind the Allied lines to conduct a counterattack or cut them off. Lee urged the Admiralty to act before the Goetzen made the German position on the lake unassailable. The naval chiefs, however, were in the thick of the Dardanelles campaign and told Lee they really didn't have the resources to counter this threat in far-off Africa. John Lee came up with a solution that was both modest and outrageous. He proposed transporting 2 small, fast motor launches to the lake. Their speed would enable them to conduct hit-and-run raids on the Germans, and even able to outrun the Goetzen. Moreover, these small vessels could be transported in one piece. The Admiralty agreed to his plan and commandeered two 40-foot motor launches, which they armed with 3-pound guns in the fore and a Maxim machine gun aft. As Lee was not a naval man, and this was now a naval operation, the Royal Navy now looked for a suitable officer to command this expedition. With the war in full swing, most officers were already engaged on active duties. Except one. Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Basil Spicer-Simpson. The 39-year-old Spicer-Simpson had had an undistinguished naval career up to this point. In his 25-year naval career, he'd gone AWOL, rammed another vessel, and at the beginning of the war lost a coastal defence ship off Ramsgate as he looked on from the shore whilst hosting a dinner party. By 1915, he was the oldest lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy and assigned to shore duties, which you might not find too surprising. So, whilst their lordships at the Admiralty were loath to put him in charge of any large warship, they were more than relaxed about him commanding two motor launches out in Africa. Spicer-Simpson immediately showed his slightly idiosyncratic tendencies when he suggested that the two vessels should be named Cat and Dog. The Admiralty were aghast. There was no way that two of His Majesty's ships, even these very tiny ones, could be called HMS Cat and HMS Dog. They told him to come up with something a bit better. The Lieutenant Commander, who was fluent in French as well as German, came back with the alternatives of Mimi and Toutou. Their lordships accepted these far more sensible and slightly exotic sounding names. But Spicer-Simpson had the last laugh. The names translated into the French meow and bow wow. And with the names accepted, Mimi, Toutou and their curious commander set out on a 10,000-mile journey to fight a naval battle on a lake in the middle of Africa. Travelling by ship from England to Cape Town, they then embarked on a 2,000-mile train journey to the Belgian Congo. And this was where the real fun began, because the next stage involved a 120-mile journey overland, the boats being pulled by 2 steam tractors, dozens of oxen and hundreds of African porters. The steam tractors proved far too heavy for the wooden bridges that they were travelling over. Time and time again the bridges collapsed, and on one occasion one of the huge engines ended up on its side in the bed of a stream. It took all the ingenuity and experience of a Rhodesian railway engineer turned rancher, Lieutenant Paddy Wainwright, to slowly move the tractors forward. On one occasion he had to replenish their boilers by employing over 150 local women to carry water supplies in pots on their heads. He also devised a series of winches to pull the boats, as well as the tractors, up a 6,400-foot mountain range. The expedition now reached the Luabala River. The plan had been to sail the two vessels 170 miles along the river towards Lake Tanganyika. However, they found that the Luabala was at its driest level for 6 years. On one day alone, the two vessels ran aground 14 times, which not only required a lot of hard work to free them, but also nerves of steel, as the men were working in crocodile-infested waters. Eventually, the two smallest vessels in the Royal Navy completed their journey on rafts made from empty oil drums. The expedition became dubbed Simpson's Circus. They finally arrived at the Belgian northern end of Lake Tanganyika on the 26th of October. The 10,000-mile journey had taken nearly 4 months. Spicer-Simpson's two boats were launched onto the lake just before Christmas 1915, and within days they were in action. The German naval commander on the lake, Captain Gustav Zimmer, at his base in Kigoma, had been hearing from the local tribes that something was afoot across the lake, and so on the 26th of December he dispatched one of his vessels, the Kingani, to investigate. The Kingani cruised past Spicer-Simpson's base just as the British commander was conducting Sunday prayers for his men. Bringing the religious service to a rapid conclusion, he ordered his crews onto their boats. The captain of the German vessel, Sub-Lieutenant Jung, now faced a dilemma. Whilst his 6-pound gun was far more powerful than Mimi and Toutou's, it only faced forwards. In other words, he would need to turn 180 degrees before he could engage the British vessels. Ordering his crew to fire on the British with their rifles, he started to turn the Kingani. But as he started to turn, the two motor launches sped in and opened fire. One of their shells punctured the German below the waterline. Another hit the steering house, killing Jung and 4 of his crew. The Kalinga was finished. She struck her colours, and the chief engineer waved surrender with a white handkerchief. The first Allied victory in what is sometimes called the Battle for Lake Tanganyika had taken just 11 minutes. The sound of the battle had brought a crowd of local Africans down to the shoreline who were now watching the spectacle. Simpson's Circus was certainly providing entertainment value. But at that very moment of victory, disaster almost struck. The Mimi, travelling at almost top speed, ploughed straight into the stricken German vessel. And in case you're wondering, yes, Spicer-Simpson was in command. Somehow the British boat managed to disentangle herself, and the Kalinga was escorted back to the Allied side of the lake. There she was patched up and joined Spicer-Simpson's flotilla, where the Maverick commander named her HMS Fifi. It was just over a month before HMS Fifi, Mimi and Toutou would be in action again. On the 9th of February, another German armed vessel, the Hedwig von Wissmann, appeared on the horizon. The Germans had become increasingly concerned as to the fate of the Kalinga, and had dispatched the 66-foot Hedwig under Lieutenant Job Oberrecht on a reconnaissance mission. Imagine 23-year-old Oberrecht's surprise when he saw the Kalinga now sailing towards him, flying the white ensign of the Royal Navy. Even more surprising was that the Kalinga, or should we say HMS Fifi, was now armed with a 12-pounder gun on her bow. On the bridge was Spicer-Simpson, now promoted to the rank of commander after his first victory. In his wake came HMS Mimi and HMS Toutou. Eager to notch up another win, Spicer-Simpson ordered his 12-pounder to fire on the Hedwig. The shot sailed past Lieutenant Oberrecht, but the force of the recoil stopped HMS Fifi in her tracks. The German seized the opportunity to turn tail and put some distance between himself and the Fifi before another more accurate shot could be fired. As the Fifi floundered in the lake, HMS Mimi raced past to take up the fight. Just as in the last action, the Mimi and the Toutou were hopelessly outgunned, but also as before, they were faster, and the Hedwig, just like the Kalinga, could only fire forwards. As long as Lieutenant Oberrecht fled across the lake, they could snap at his heels, firing into his unprotected stern. So he now tried to turn to face the motor launches. They, in turn, desperately tried to evade a shot by trying to stay behind the German. Eventually, after a 30-mile chase, Fifi arrived back on the scene. Firing her second-to-last shell, she hit the Hedwig's hull, and the German started to take on water. Then, with her very last shell, HMS Fifi hit Hedwig's engine room. The German boat erupted into flames, and as the burning vessel sank beneath the water, 20 German sailors, Europeans and local Africans, leapt into the lake and were captured. Included in their number was Lieutenant Oberrecht. It was just 2 weeks before his 24th birthday. Job Oberrecht would survive the war and end up serving in the Luftwaffe during World War II, where he became a general in charge of a flak regiment. Now the only German ship on the lake was the Goetzen. Despite having a gun from the cruiser Königsberg mounted on her, Captain Zimmer refused to engage Spicer-Simpson's little flotilla. But because of that Königsberg gun, Spicer-Simpson also refused to take on the German. Effectively, it was a stalemate. But a stalemate was good enough for the Allies. With the Goetzen holed up in Kigoma, German supremacy on the lake had been broken. There would be no further German attacks into British or Belgian territory. And now the Allies were able to advance into German East Africa without fear of being cut off by enemy troops crossing the lake behind them. The Battle of Lake Tanganyika had been an Allied success. Spicer-Simpson was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, DSO. 3 of his officers received Distinguished Service Crosses, whilst 12 of his men received Distinguished Service Medals. It was this battle and Simpson's Circus which inspired C.S. Forester to write The African Queen in the 1930s, which in itself inspired the 1951 film. Neither the book nor the film were documentaries. The African Queen is an adventure, with some romance, set on a lake during the East Africa campaign. Bogart and Hepburn are civilians who decide to use their small craft to sink a powerful German warship. As you now know, the actions on Lake Tanganyika were conducted by the Royal Navy, not civilians, and the biggest boat that Spicer-Simpson sank was the Hedwig, not the mighty Goetzen. Nevertheless, it's a great film, which was actually shot on location in Africa, which is pretty amazing in 1951. 2 boats were used as the African Queen, and both of them survive to this day. One can be found in Uganda, and the other has been restored and now provides cruises for tourists around Key West in Florida. Personally, I think The African Queen is a great story, but the real-life story of Simpson's Circus and the Battle of Lake Tanganyika is almost just as good, isn't it? By the middle of July 1916, with Belgian troops advancing on Kigoma, Captain Zimmer stripped the Goetzen of its guns and scuttled the ship in the harbour. The war in East Africa would run on until the end of hostilities in Europe in 1918. In fact, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck and his men hold the distinction of being the very last German army to surrender at the end of the First World War. An incredible story. Commander Spicer-Simpson, DSO, served the remainder of the war back in London, working in naval intelligence, and was part of the naval delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference. He died in 1947, having never commanded any further Royal Navy vessels. HMS Mimi and HMS Toutou would see no further action in the war either. Mimi was scuttled in the early 1920s. So too was HMS Fifi. Having returned to service as a passenger vessel on the lake after the war, she was deemed unseaworthy and taken out of service in 1924. Interestingly, the German vessel whose presence had alarmed big game hunter John Lee and led to Simpson's Circus, the Goetzen, would be resurfaced after the war. Renamed the MV Liemba, she became a civilian vessel, carrying passengers and cargo up and down the lake. In fact, amazingly, she is still doing that to this very day. A working naval vessel from the First World War, still plying Lake Tanganyika. Maybe she is the real African Queen. Coming soon, the story of the German East Africa campaign that I've just been talking about, so please subscribe so you don't miss that. And please also consider joining my supporters club. There's a link in the description below. Help me feed the YouTube algorithm with a like, hit the subscribe button, or comment. Until next time, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.